We'll discuss, are there any examples? Let's start by looking at our lesson question. What challenges did immigrants face as they adjusted to life in the US? So let's break it down. First, we're going to talk about how did immigrants need to adapt to America. Then we'll talk about what resistance did they face while they were trying to adapt. And finally, we'll discuss, are there any examples that will help us understand this experience any better? But first, we're going to start at the beginning. Let's take a look at how did immigrants need to adapt to life in America. So to start there, let's talk about the word culture. Culture is the shared beliefs, values, and ways of life of a group. This includes things like the way someone dresses, the food that they eat, the music they listen to, and the language that they speak. For immigrants, it was very difficult to try to hold on to their own personal cultures while still trying to adapt to becoming an American. So we know that moving to the United States was incredibly difficult for immigrants. So why would they do it? Well, there were several reasons for immigrating in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Many immigrants came for the economic opportunity, the chance to make money, to make life better and more comfortable for themselves and for their families. Still others, like the Jews of Eastern Europe, they moved here because of religious persecution that was going on in their home country, and they came to the United States for the chance at religious freedom. Now, most immigrants moved to the cities and they ended up working in more challenging jobs, jobs like mills and factories and assembly plants. Now, remember that these immigrants didn't speak English often and that they were less skilled than some of their American counterparts. Despite difficult jobs and lots of cultural changes to adapt to, immigrants tried to make the United States their home. They often lived near others from the same country, forming enclaves in major U.S. cities. An enclave is a distinct group that lives or works together within a larger community. In New York City, for example, many Jewish immigrants settled in one part of the city, the Lower East Side, while Italian immigrants formed a Little Italy in a different part of the city. Living among others who shared their culture helped these immigrants feel at home and supported. It allowed them to maintain ties with their home cultures, and it helped them keep their traditions. Within these neighborhoods, immigrants could attend religious services in their home language, find familiar foods, and continue to share customs and rituals from their home country. Although living in immigrant neighborhoods had many advantages, living conditions were usually difficult. Let's look at an example, New York City. By 1900, two-thirds of the population of New York lived in tenements. Tenement houses were crowded apartments. Tenement buildings were so close together that little natural light could get into the rooms. Because interior rooms had no windows, they also never got fresh air and they had very poor ventilation. Apartments were overcrowded, stuffed beyond capacity, with more than a dozen people sometimes living in a single room. Tenement apartments also had no indoor plumbing, meaning no sinks, no toilets, no baths or showers. Obviously, this often led to dirty, unhealthy living conditions. All right, let's look back at our lesson question. How did new immigrants face resistance when adapting to life in America? Well, we've taken a look at, at how immigrants adapted to new cultures and to their difficult living conditions. We talked about how they formed enclaves to feel more at home, and we talked about how they were forced to live in tenement houses. Now let's take a look at what resistance they faced while they were trying to adapt to life in the United States. Unfortunately, established Americans weren't always happy with having all these new immigrants coming into their country.
We know the challenges that immigrants had in terms of culture and different places to live. But did you know that discrimination was also a major problem? Outside their neighborhoods or enclaves, immigrants often faced unwelcoming communities. Immigrants faced discrimination or unfair treatment because of their heritage. Some immigrant groups were excluded when applying for jobs or weren't paid equal wages if they did get a job. They also faced unfair treatment when searching for housing and educational opportunities. They were often restricted from these things. Immigrants were often harassed and intimidated by organized groups. One group that you might have heard of was the Ku Klux Klan, which violently intimidated many immigrants in the 1920s.
Nativism and immigration. Nativism is the belief that immigrants are inferior to established Americans. Nativists believe that established Americans were naturally better than immigrants, especially those immigrants that were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Some nativists blamed immigrants for problems such as overcrowding, poverty, crime, and violence and unemployment. They felt that new immigrants were competition for jobs that they felt should have been going to established Americans. Nativists also believed immigrants would destroy American culture. They particularly feared immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, whose culture was a bit different from older immigrants from places like Ireland and Northern Europe. They feared these new immigrants would pollute American culture. Many Americans feared that Catholic and Jewish immigrants would threaten America's religion, steering Americans away from Protestant Christianity. They also feared that immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe had an inferior culture, one that would weaken America. And they thought that immigrants would be unable to assimilate and become truly American, that they would instead try to replace American culture with their own. As a result of efforts by nativists, many changes in immigration policy took place in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Here are some important examples that you should know about. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. The act prohibited most Chinese workers from entering the United States. This was the first time in history that the U.S. government had excluded a specific ethnic group from immigrating. It was not repealed until 1943. In 1917, Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1917, and it was meant to restrict immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. One of the most important parts of the act was that it required immigrants to be able to read and to write. In 1921, the Emergency Quota Act placed limits on the number of people who could immigrate from each country, based on how many people from that country were already living in the United States in the year 1910. Then, in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act established new quotas for immigrants from Europe. This made it more difficult for Southern and Eastern Europeans to come to the United States, while making it easier for Northern Europeans to do so. Immigration is still a major debate in the United States today. Not all Americans agree on how immigration should work, on what rights immigrants should have, and what it should take to become a citizen. If you watch the news and you listen closely, I promise you'll probably hear something about immigration. Let's go back to our lesson question. How did new immigrants face resistance when adapting to life in America? So now in this last section, we've taken a look at how immigrants faced nativism and discrimination. Now we're going to look at an example that will help us understand this experience. We're going to look at Chinese immigrants in the 1800s. Now, in the mid-1800s, early Chinese immigrants called the west coast of the United States, specifically around California, Gold Mountain. They saw it as a land of opportunity where they could strike it rich in a gold rush, or they could get a good job, enough to send money back home to their families in China. So during the 1850s, Chinese immigration to America skyrocketed. Many immigrants were drawn to the California gold rush and the chance to strike it rich. Now, immigrants also came to participate in building railroads, especially the Transcontinental Railroad, and they often hoped to find jobs in West Coast cities. Now, many of these immigrants were also looking for opportunities to send money home to their families who were still living in China, because most of these immigrants were men who came over by themselves. By 1852, 25,000 Chinese immigrants had come to seek their fortunes on Gold Mountain. Now, in West Coast cities, many Chinese immigrants settled in enclave neighborhoods for the reasons that we learned about earlier. It provided them safety, togetherness, and it made it easier to adapt to America. These neighborhoods were often called Chinatowns, and in fact, many of these neighborhoods are still around today. Maybe you visited a neighborhood like this. In the 1800s, early Chinatowns included ones in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Seattle. So why would this be such a big problem? These communities helped Chinese Americans to adapt and to make it in America. While many Americans reacted harshly to these communities, Chinatowns were often pretty different from the rest of their home cities. As a result, Americans felt like these Chinatowns were too unlike other parts of the city. They felt that they were strange and unsettling. A whole part of the city where people spoke a different language, or many different Chinese languages. A whole part of the city with a completely different culture. Now, this made Chinatown residents seem like outsiders. They also believed that Chinatowns were full of crime and violence, and that Chinese immigrants were too willing to participate in these problems. Overall, many Americans on the West Coast perceived Chinatowns to be a source of trouble in their cities, a place that they should avoid or get rid of. And as a result of these anti Chinatown feelings, violent anti Chinese riots occurred in Chinatowns in many different cities in the 1800s and early 1900s. These crowds would attack Chinese immigrants and they would destroy parts of the Chinatowns during these riots. Chinatowns weren't the only problems, though. And remember, when we say problem, we mean in a nativist American's eye. In addition to resentment towards Chinatowns and Chinese American culture, many American white workers greatly resented Chinese laborers. They believed it was unfair for Chinese workers to accept lower pay, that this gave Chinese workers an unfair advantage in employers' eyes. And they thought that the Chinese workers were taking away jobs that ought to go to American citizens. Labor unions were a part of this too. Now, often they actively opposed Chinese workers and they wouldn't allow them to join their union. Let's talk about exclusion. Exclusion is the act of keeping someone or something out. American citizens with anti Chinese feelings continually petitioned Congress to find a way to exclude Chinese immigrants. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. The act did exactly what the name says it does. It excluded immigrants and restricted their ability to come to America. It prohibited any Chinese laborer from entering the country for 10 years, and it also made it impossible for Chinese immigrants already here to become citizens. Now, this wasn't repealed until 1943. The Chinese Exclusion Act limited the number of Chinese immigrants that were allowed into the United States, but it did not end anti Asian sentiment. Japanese immigrants were soon chosen as the next target. According to the 1907 Gentlemen's Agreement that the United States had with Japan, San Francisco would stop segregating Japanese students in schools, which happened in response to anti Japanese sentiment that was going on in the city at that time. In exchange, Japan would stop issuing passports to Japanese citizens that were intending to immigrate into the United States. Japanese immigration was limited greatly until 1924.